Good evening. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlotte Potter-Kasich. I am the interim director here at the Barry Museum of Art. The Barry Art Museum is located on the Old Dominion University campus in Norfolk, Virginia. We were founded by art collectors Richard and Carolyn Barry in 2016, and we opened our doors to the public in November of 2018. Our collection has strong holdings in three primary areas: paintings, contemporary glass sculpture, historic dolls, and automatons. In paintings, we have everything from American modernist to historic marine. Contemporary glass sculpture with artists such as Monier from Armenian. And historic dolls and automatons with everything from American, French, other European countries, and Japanese dolls. We have a variety of exhibitions. Currently on view is Orchids, Attraction and Deception. The work included in this exhibition ranges widely, mirroring its inspiration, which is one of the largest and most diverse plant groups on the planet. From pure botanical fascination to climate change, from historic model making to the history of collecting and colonization, the 10 contemporary artists represented in this exhibition approach the orchid from very different angles. This evening, we're going to hear a little bit more from Jennifer Angus, who I just showed on the screen. Also on view is Pandemic, reflecting on a year of quarantine. This is a nice intimate exhibition that just came on display with everything from contemporary dance, glass, sculpture, and painting. Upcoming this fall, we have a remarkable exhibition by the artist Karen Lamont. She is a sculptor, American sculptor, who lives and works in Prague. And she'll be showing both her full scale and 1/3 scale glass, white bronze, and iron sculptures. Also next fall, we have Luke Jerram's Museum of the Moon. This is a 3-day pop-up exhibition from October 15th, 16th, and 17th. Mark your calendars. It is not to be missed. It is a large, huge piece that will be suspended over 43rd Street right here on the Old Dominion University campus with a street fair and festival. We have a variety of free public programs here at the Barry Art Museum. The first is our Multimedia Tours, which you can sign up for anytime. We encourage you to come check us out. It's all online, contactless. The next is Art-Inspired Yoga, which is pre-recorded and you can check out on our YouTube channel. We have take-home activities such as paint by numbers, memory cards, geometry, paper dolls. You can do all of this from the comfort of your own home, as well as, of course, our Cross-Pollination Lecture series, which is the reason that we are all here tonight. First, I'm going to introduce Jennifer Angus. She's an artist, researcher, and writer who takes hold of her audience through the creation of patterns with insects. Her research is driven by her personal interest in patterns' ability to say everything without saying anything at all. She believes that there's a cultural understanding for patterns, and that provides a potential for imbued narrative. Angus's combination of beauty and pattern and the hesitation that is felt around insects come together to create wonderfully conflicting pieces. Angus is a professor in design studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her BFA from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Creating some of the most provocative work in art museum settings, like you see here, Angus's medium is, well, as we said, insects. Jennifer has exhibited her work internationally, including Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and Spain. She's received awards from the Canada Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the University of Wisconsin. Recently, she received the inaugural Forward Art Prize for Outstanding Women in the Arts. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Angus.
Hello, everyone. Let me get this slideshow going. Well, thank you all for joining this evening. I thought I would take this opportunity to explain how I developed the idea for this exhibition, because it was a little outside of the norm for me. And so rather than a survey, this is a real reason to tune in if you ever wondered how artists figure things out and do what they do. So I am perhaps best known for this work that was at the Renwick Museum, part of the Smithsonian American Art Museums. The Renwick is kitty corner to the White House, and in 2015-16, nearly 500,000 people saw this work as part of Wonder. And as has been described, insects that's my material, that's my medium. And so as we approach orchids, I think it was quite wise to think, oh, Jennifer Angus works with insects. Insects, flowers, orchids, there must be a connection. So that was how I was contacted. Now, I take a lot of inspiration from the Victorian era. And right away when this was presented to me, I thought, ooh, I'll bet orchids means something in this thing called Victorian flower language. So the things that are left over from that, roses meaning love, forget-me-nots, that's pretty obvious. And indeed, and when I looked up orchids, they also represent love and affection. So I thought, okay, this is something that I can work with. And I thought back to an exhibition that I had done earlier where I had made fabric flowers that I had hand dyed silk rayon velvet in natural dyes. And I thought, oh, I should do that for orchids. And indeed, so I dye the fabric, but then I send the fabric to the last fabric flower manufacturer in Manhattan. And these were the styles that they had. So I was like, okay, we've got insects, we've got flower orchids, but what else? And what I learned is that there was real orchid mania in the Victorian era. And I just loved that. Oh, here we have those fabric flowers that I had made earlier. And there's a bit of a play there between what's 2D and 3D. So as I was saying, the orchid mania in the Victorian era. And again, that's my time period, so much exploration, discovery, and perhaps importantly to me, collecting. So I thought about Victorian interiors and this orchid mania in which people were sending others out to collect orchids. You could be an orchid collector. And I wanted to capture that feel of adventure was my first thought. And recently I had been doing I teach textile design, so I had been doing some design work in which I was using vintage matchbox labels and altering them. And one of my interests is that insects are attracted to light. So here on these prints, you see the bees or the butterflies coming towards these matches. So I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking, oh, maybe I should make a wallpaper. And you see the William Morris design on the right-hand side. And here I was trying to build something up. And these were just all initial ideas. And then I decided, no, too much in the wallpaper. It's people, they want to see the orchids and the insects. And so then I came up with this idea of just a strip, a kind of demarcation of the wainscoting. And what I was thinking about, and I was thinking, oh, this really captures, adventure, going out into the jungle, a place where orchids would be. And I was thinking about bell jars, just a classic way to show things. And this came about from finding this illustration of orchids under a bell jar. And I had experience with that. This is a project that I actually did in Oshkosh, and I happen to be in Oshkosh, Wisconsin right now. And the bell jars held botanical matter, insects, and a Victorian era microscope slide. And some of these are quite funny. I mean, on the right-hand side is a male bed bug, and on the other side is, well, I can't quite see it, so maybe you can't. Anyway, they were all insect related. And I thought, oh, well, I can put orchids in here, perhaps. Here's some more bell jars with a few more insects. So these were initial ideas. And then I threw out this, oh, how about these circular frames, also very Victorian, where there could be anything under them because they've got a deep glass. It's actually plexi, but that seemed like something fun that I could play with. And that there would be this whole extravaganza of bell jars and stuff. And if you've seen the work at the Berry, you'll know that my aesthetic is one of very busy. And of course, I had to, beyond the flower or fabric orchids, I could get dried orchids. And so I started to think about maybe making some arrangements in a kind of cabinet of curiosities, if you will. And I have to say that my initial search, I wasn't overly impressed with what I could get. So I presented this idea to the team at the Berry, and I was told, we need more orchids. And to really seriously think about not just orchids, but pods of orchids. And I have to say the meat and potatoes of my operation, so to speak, is cicadas, which are not pollinators. So, and of course, I'm sure that many of you are aware of the Orchid Conservancy on the campus, the university campus, which unfortunately, due to COVID, I didn't get to visit until I came to install. But once that was really hammered home to me, I went back to the drawing board and said, okay, where can I take this? I was still interested in the Victorian flower language, and what these are calling cards, Victorian calling cards. So you would stop by before the age of the phone, you would stop by a friend or acquaintance house and leave your calling card. And they inevitably had flowers on them, which, as I mentioned, meant something. Of course, your name. Also, these disembodied hands, which frankly, I to this day find disturbing. What is this Victorian obsession with hands? And so, or even in this case, a disembodied arm. And so I decided, I'm going to do something with these. And what I did was I had my Victorian calling cards, and essentially I photoshopped them and I put in orchids, which I knew to have meaning. And this was the first iteration, in which these are decals with those calling card images at the bottom, and then real insects. This is just my mock-up. This is something that most people actually don't get to see. I have a picture of each insect to scale on my computer so that I can figure everything out. And here I added a bit of a swarm. But what's with these hands? Well, in my search for orchids, I came across this ceramic hand with an orchid. And I thought, how perfect, because I had that inspiration of the calling card, but also that hand. I thought of it as, you know, a sign of man's greed, of collecting, our implication in all of these natural systems. And I kind of just ran with that. And then, of course, I did have to have orchids, and I found a wonderful source in Malaysia for dried and pressed orchids. And so this is the installation at the Berry, and we'll take a closer look. So you can see that I've got my hands on the shelves, which are all the hands are holding a fabric orchid. So I did follow through on that. And those are decals and greatly enlarged images from the calling cards. Here are the hands, and there now you get to see the fabric flowers a little bit better. And then I made 34 new works that were in the domes, and they all had orchids and they all had pollinators. Now, I wasn't able to be so specific to be able to say, yes, this insect pollinates this particular orchid, but I used beetles and bees and wasps and some spun cotton birds, but particularly hummingbirds, which are also pollinators. So I'm showing you 24, but one of them that I made used the vanilla bean. And I was fortunate to have traveled to Costa Rica a number of years ago. And so I was aware that vanilla came from an orchid plant. And it was a little bit sad that it was within a dome, so we don't get that wonderful scent. But I thought myself to be quite clever, honestly, to include the orchid in this work. And so that's my last slide, and I hope I've given you a little insight into the development of my work.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Excellent. That was such a fun process to put this together with you. You were so generous through the whole thing. I felt horrible bringing you back to the drawing board a couple times. One thing I should have mentioned is when we were developing this exhibit, we partnered with the people at the Kaplan Orchid Conservatory, as well as Orchid Societies and the Norfolk Botanical Gardens. So when we came to Jenny and sort of commissioned her to make this brand new piece, I felt so bad, but we kept on saying, we really need to be exact about this relationship between the pollinators, and you did such a fabulous job. And it's really, I mean, if you haven't seen the show yourself yet, you have to come. It really is a showstopper, absolutely. Okay, so next I am going to introduce Kenneth. So Dr. Kenneth Cameron's research focuses on understanding patterns and processes that shape the incredible diversity of the orchid family, but especially those orchids related to vanilla, the natural source of the world's most popular flavor and fragrance. In his popular book, Vanilla, Orchids, Natural History and Cultivation, is now out of print and has become a collector's item, but he continues to share his knowledge and passion for orchids widely. Together with students and colleagues around the world, Dr. Cameron has contributed significantly to our fundamental knowledge of orchid biology through research conducted in the field, greenhouse, and laboratory. He continues to work towards the goal of producing a stable system of classification for the orchid family and ensuring their conservation for future generations. I have to say, one of the funnest parts of this whole series was the serendipitous moment where somebody mentioned Ken's name and we realized that both Ken and Jenny are on the same campus but have never met. And that your work was, both of your research was so well paired. So without further ado, I give you Ken Cameron.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Jenny, for the overview of your installation. I attended the virtual opening of the show and was really happy that you included vanilla beans within your installation. And as you've heard from Jenny, but also, I suppose, from different panelists over the last several weeks, the orchid family is really well known for its diversity. Like the insect world that's so diverse, there are more than 25,000 different species of orchids found throughout the world, making it possibly the largest family of plants on Earth. And yet, when we think about, when we think about vanilla and its diversity, it's really quite curious to realize that only one of these species, Vanilla planifolia, is of major agricultural value. And that's the orchid I'm going to be talking to you about today. So as you can imagine, it really irks me when I hear people using vanilla as an adjective to mean lacking distinction, plain, ordinary, or conventional. And I hope to convince you over the next couple of minutes that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, when we look back at humans' interaction with vanilla as a flavor and a fragrance, we have to go back thousands of years to Central America, and in particular to an area of Mexico, the current state of Veracruz, where the indigenous Totonac people, depicted here on the left, were the first to have domesticated this plant, vanilla. On the right is the great Aztec Empire. And they're meeting in the ancient city of El Tajín and depicted in a large mural by Diego Rivera in Mexico City. And what we see between those two great civilizations is a vanilla vine right there up the middle. And we know that this plant was very important as a sacred plant to both cultures. Eventually, of course, that civilization would collapse, but you can still visit the city of Papantla and the ruins of the El Tajín pyramid. I was there a couple of years ago. But even more remarkable is that as you wander the village of Papantla, first you can smell vanilla in the air, but you also notice that many of the artists in the region have drawn incredible murals on their buildings throughout the city, depicting this plant that's so important to their culture. The picture on the upper left really inspires me. It's of a human heart with vanilla flowers coming out of it. And a lot of the local people tell me, you know, vanilla is part of our blood. It's part of our ancestry. We know vanilla like nobody else. And in fact, many of the Totonac people continue their tradition of cultivating vanilla and doing hand pollination as their ancestors did for thousands of years. Of course, Europeans would ultimately visit the New World and discover vanilla. These are the earliest representations we know of, probably from Spanish conquistadors who in the 16th century showed plants that were, you know, we're not 100% sure these are vanilla. One of them is called tilshashil, meaning the black flower, but it was probably referencing the black fruits of the vanilla bean, and certainly looks like a vanilla to me. So today now we think of this popular orchid as ranking among the most expensive of natural traded commodities on the world market. Vanilla beans have been traded in recent years as high as $500 per kilogram. And if you cook with natural vanilla, you know that these are quite pricey. And yet it's remarkable to consider that there's still so much we just don't know about these far from ordinary orchids. For example, this is a wild species growing in a palm swamp in Peru called Vanilla grandiflora. And just look at the size of these fruits, these vanilla beans. Actually, I think that one of your biologists at Old Dominion University, Dr. Tatiana Lobova, might have been part of the expedition where this photograph was taken. And I remember that she told me the scent of these fruits as they were decomposing and fermenting was just overpowering. So, you know, why is this plant not in cultivation? Why don't we know more about it? That's been the focus of my own personal research for the last 20 or so years. I work with DNA and I reconstruct genetic relationships across the entire orchid family. And one of the most profound results that we uncovered in the early analyses was that vanilla and its closest relatives represent an entirely unique lineage of the large orchid family. It's quite a primitive branch of the orchid tree of life. And it's allowed us to reclassify this species, Vanilla planifolia, within its own subtribe, its own tribe, and indeed its own unique subfamily within this gigantic orchid family, the subfamily Vanilloideae. And that's been the focus of a lot of my research. But Vanilla planifolia is really just one species in this pantropical genus of more than 100 species, and new species of vanilla continue to be described every year. And we know that diversity is important, especially in agricultural systems. For example, I've been talking about Vanilla planifolia, depicted here in the middle. That's our standard. That's the vanilla that most of us would enjoy from the supermarket. But if you're a foodie, you may know that you can pay a premium for Tahitian vanilla, Vanilla tahitensis, that's grown mostly in the Pacific Islands. Or if you visit Central America, you might buy a lower quality plant called Vanilla pompona. So there are different species, but there's been no serious attempt to hybridize or improve this agricultural crop. And so again, my research has attempted to look at the relationships of the domesticated Vanilla planifolia, marked here with the red star. And we've seen through DNA analysis that that is one species descended from a common ancestor exclusively from the New World. So from North and South America, these are all leafy vines. They all produce fragrant fruits. And that's in contrast to the vanillas from Africa, Asia, the Old World, and the Caribbean, which descend from a different lineage and actually do not have fragrant fruits at all, but they have some other unique traits that crop breeders and geneticists might want to consider. So Vanilla planifolia domesticated in Central America, probably Mexico, but today is primarily grown in Madagascar and the Bourbon Islands of the Indian Ocean. And Madagascar exports almost 1,000 metric tons of vanilla beans each year, representing half of the vanilla market and 10% of that country's own gross domestic product. It's so important to their economy that vanilla plants are even depicted by artists on the banknotes within Madagascar, if you can see down here in the lower left corner. So it's really not an exaggeration, I think, to say that Vanilla planifolia may be the world's most abundant, popular, and valuable orchid. It's used as a flavoring and a fragrance agent in so many products. Unfortunately, the demand for natural vanilla has been skyrocketing. And I took a screenshot a couple of years ago while I was watching CNN of this news story that ice cream makers were reporting a vanilla price surge of more than 150%. There was actually a lot of concern that the market might collapse. And one reason for that is, number one, the demand for natural products, but also the increased popularity of vanilla in new emerging world markets. For example, in parts of Asia that do not have a tradition of growing or using vanilla the way that we do in the West. And so these are some pictures I took on a trip to China where I could buy green tea and black tea and other products scented with vanilla. So there's just growing demand. Another reason that vanilla is so expensive has to do with its biology. These are climbing vines, very large plants. When you think about it, not too many of our agricultural crops come from vines, maybe grapes and kiwis and a couple of other things. But not only are they large vines, but they grow in wet, dark, tropical rainforests. And in an agricultural farm setting, it's hard to recreate that system. So people have come up with creative solutions of bamboo trellises or bags filled with compost, like this woman in Mexico, or growing them on tree supports within organic systems. Another reason that it's so expensive, and you may know this already, is that the natural pollinator, the insect, a type of bee, that would normally pollinate vanilla flowers in Mexico or South Central America is absent in Madagascar and parts of the old world. And therefore, in those countries, all vanilla flowers must be hand pollinated in a very narrow window of time each morning while the plant is fertile and receptive. This is a very labor intensive crop. And that hand pollination aspect is a fascinating story. It was actually discovered or invented by a young boy at the age of 12 who was born into slavery on the island of Reunion named Edmund Albius. And he literally revolutionized the vanilla industry, but unfortunately died a poor man and was never truly recognized for his major contribution. So let's assume that this pollination has been successful. The Mexicans actually refer to it as the marriage of the vanilla flower. It literally takes the vanilla fruit 9 months to develop. So you're already seeing, marriage and 9 months of gestation, lots of symbolism there. And in fact, there's quite some romantic mythology around the origin of this plant and the tree support that it grows on. But 9 months after development and harvesting, the vanilla beans have to be fermented. They have to be cured and dried. And they're done in these warehouses on racks wrapped in blankets, as you can see here. And then during the day, brought out into the sunshine, spread out, and allowed to air dry in the warm sun. And this is the same method that's been done for decades. You can see some old photographs here on the bottom left. Then taken back in at night, taken back out in the day, over and over again until the perfect consistency is achieved. Not too dry or they'd be brittle, not too soft or they might get moldy. And there are well-trained experts who've been doing this generation after generation. They sort the beans, they wrap them and cure them and prepare them for market. These are worth their weight in gold. And so they are literally locked in a vault in these metal boxes with armed guards at the door before they're shipped around the world. So a very expensive crop, one that we all enjoy. We enjoy it in many different forms, pastes and extracts and whole beans and crystals and so forth and so on. But one of the traditional uses in Mexico is to use vanilla beans as room air fresheners, deodorizers, in the form of little figuras. very similar to Jenny's work in the installation, where vanilla beans are molded and wrapped and turned into beautiful little works of art, baskets, hearts, flowers, Don Quixote. And I was fortunate to watch two masters, a husband and wife team, as they were wrapping vanilla beans in preparation for the annual ceremony where the vanilla queen would be crowned for the year. And this is the crown that she ultimately would wear on her head. So I hope that over the last couple of minutes, I've convinced you that there's truly nothing plain about vanilla. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. Fantastic. No, I don't think there's anything plain about vanilla. And it was funny. I remember when Jenny proposed the idea of bringing olfactory vanilla into this space. We got so excited about the notion of having another sense involved. I mean, her work is already wildly overwhelming and wonderful in that way. But like, let's add some more. But it is behind that, you know, acrylic, as she said, so you can't smell it in the space the same way that.
Or it's too bad you couldn't taste it.
You know, if only it wasn't COVID, we could have done some food pairings and had a really elaborate, you know, like dinner situation perhaps, but yeah, not in this day.
One of the most fun things I ever got to do is to attend the International Vanilla Congress. And it happened to be in Cannes on the French Riviera that year. It's a tough life. Somebody's got to do it. And the Haagen-Dazs company came with samples of vanilla ice cream, unmarked, except they were labeled A, B, C, D, or whatever. And all the participants were allowed to taste them and then score kind of our perception on a card. And you wouldn't believe it, but everyone was really different. Whether the beans come from Mexico or Madagascar or Indonesia or Tahiti or artificial vanilla flavoring. Some people actually prefer that over the natural. And so when I speak to orchid societies, I often bring a cooler with, it's nice that if you go to the supermarket, Breyers has like 5 different vanillas. They've got French vanilla, natural vanilla, vanilla custard, whatever. And yeah, so combining that kind of visual aspect of the flowers with the fragrance and the taste is really fun.
Yeah. Speaking of travel, I've just through a conversation with both of you, I'm putting together that you both have traveled extensively in Central America. And I'm sort of wondering, Jenny, if there's been some influence on you in your work through some of that work that you've done with students.
Well, actually, I more recently have been traveling to Latin America. But the bulk of my travel has been in Southeast Asia, and most of the insects that I use in my work are, well, primarily from Thailand, which has the world's greatest diversity of cicadas. We're not supposed to be talking about cicadas since they're not pollinators, but, and Malaysia. And to me, to see, though I am not collecting myself because that would be like a whole nother job, and I am not an entomologist, I think there's great value in seeing these insects in their natural habitat. In fact, sorry, back to cicadas, I just this past weekend went to Princeton because that's one of the hot spots for the emergence of brood 10 or brood X, as we've been calling it because of the Roman numeral. And it's certainly one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. I don't know, is it happening in Norfolk or not?
I haven't seen any. I keep on seeing your Instagram and how they're shedding, and I keep on waiting to hear the cicadas like come to life. I haven't yet, but I'll send you videos when it happens.
But I wanted to say is that I'm so glad that I did that. I was the weather was terrible. And it started I was there for 4 days. It rained 3 of them. And I was such a cheerleader for them. And I was with some other hardcore people. So my first day, we stayed out till 11:30 at night because that's when the nymphs come out, and then they molt and they become the tenorals, so the white cicada for about an hour. But during the day, when it was raining, I would find these adult cicadas on the ground. They were still alive, and I would pick them up, and they want to be up on a tree. And I just kept picking them up, and I started to feel like a matchmaker. And depending on where I put them, and considering, trying my best to help them. But yeah, I really started to think, oh, maybe there's going to be a love hotel, cicada love hotel in the future. So I think anyone who's working with a natural material, seeing it in its natural habitat is just so potentially inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the vanilla bean fields for the first time, I had no idea the labor and the fact that they had to be hand pollinated mostly. That was all new information for me. I'm so impressed by the fact that you've dived so much into cicadas, Jenny, and you've dived so much into vanilla, Ken. And it's interesting how unbelievably specified our practices can take us. I mean, if you had ever told me that this would be the conversation that we'd be having, it's really quite fascinating.
It's true, but at least in my field, and I think this must be true in the arts too, you start with a very narrow kind of medium or subject matter, and you kind of specialize in that, but it often takes you in a direction that you didn't anticipate. So because vanilla is one of the only climbing vines in this big orchid family, I got interested in the biology of vines for a while. And that took me in a different direction to studying a group of climbing vines called catbriers. You have a lot of them in Virginia. And so I did a whole bunch of research in that area. And then it kind of brings you back to your original starting place on the biology of vanilla, and this reciprocal illumination of one project and going off in different tangents, I think is what makes our work so interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say that having this somewhat prescribed focus of orchid, the topic actually, I have to admit, had been predetermined before I had come to the Barry Art Museum. But then the more I got into it, the more fascinated I became with it. But it was a similar kind of thing to realize suddenly how many different topics you can touch upon through this one very narrow focus. And obviously I didn't even dive as deep as vanilla yet, but yeah, it's been a really wonderful journey. We do have some questions popping up in the Q&A, and I would encourage anybody watching, feel free to pop more up there. I have a couple. The first says, it's for you, Jenny, and it says, this is not a question, just fangirling out. Oshkosh is my hometown. I'm so happy to know that little city is showing such an incredible art. Jennifer, I'm so happy to hear you speak about your work. I attended UW-Madison and graduated in 2015. Go Badgers. I was in the Glasgow and never got to meet you, but I'm so proud to see you repping Wisconsin. Thank you for sharing with us. And the next question is also for Jenny regarding specifically some of the information about insects. So are the insects reused and redisplayed for various compositions? And what happens to the insects after a show?
Yeah, so at the conclusion of the show, the insects will be packed into storage boxes by species. They're pinned onto foam core trays and the lid sealed until the next show. And these insects have been going for more than 20 years, some of them. I'm here in Oshkosh at the Payne taking down a show, and I'm realizing just how old some of these are. They are by no means pristine specimens, and I always keep the best ones at eye level, the not so great stuff high up or low down. But yeah, I mean, not only is it morally the right thing to do, I often think of the insects as ambassadors for their species with this prolonged afterlife. But financially, they're not particularly cheap, and I just can't even begin to imagine throwing them out. Anything that is damaged, and most of the damage tends to happen on the takedown, actually, more so than installing. I repair them, and we have what we call our hospital. And usually when you're tired of being on your feet, you sit down and do some surgery, sometimes having to do a few transplants when you don't have exactly the right pieces to put together.
Will you be
That's-
able to preserve those orchid flowers, the pressed orchids that you included?
That'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm curious. I should ask for a report because they were dried, and I would think, though the museum is climate controlled, that the flowers may be sort of, bending a bit, because one of the challenges I had was they are very flat and I had these domes, and so my solution was I took a toothpick and I put a button on the toothpick, and then I glued the orchid to the toothpick so that I could have some depth. But I think as long as they stay in their frames, and the frames do have a UV protectant on them, hopefully they'll stay bright and beautiful.
Yeah.
I
Well,
have a question actually about vanilla in Madagascar. So was this imported there, since they don't have the bee to actually fertilize it?
Yeah, we don't have a written account of exactly how vanilla was moved around by Europeans, but the speculation is that the Spanish took it from Central America back to Spain, and it just never really caught on within Spanish culture or cuisine. When we think about Spanish foods, we tend to think of spicier things, chilies and cinnamon and that kind of thing. But the French were introduced to vanilla, and it really caught on in French culture. And so the French, because they controlled a lot of the tropical areas of the world, of tropical Africa and Madagascar and the French Polynesia, they took the vines to their territories and began cultivating it, in their own French areas. In fact, that's reminds me of something I should have said. When you buy vanilla, it's often labeled Bourbon Vanilla, and people think that means Maker's Mark, or some kind of bourbon whiskey, but it's not. It refers to the Bourbon French aristocracy. The French monarchy were the Bourbons, and those were known as the Bourbon Islands, Réunion, Mauritius, Madagascar. Although it is true that natural vanilla extract has to be done mostly in an alcohol-based solution, but not necessarily bourbon.
And since we're talking about Madagascar, I'll just add that the kind of swarm that's happening in my installation of grasshoppers that actually have kind of pinky wings happen to come from Madagascar. And they are part of a development project. And that's a question that I'm frequently asked about, where did the insects come from? And when at all possible, I do like to use farmed insects. So those ones happen to come from Madagascar too. So there's a theme going on here.
Absolutely. We have a few other questions in here. So Titania Labova is saying, I want to note that Dr. Cameron was a special guest and speaker at ODU when we had an official opening of the Kaplan Orchid Conservatory 13 years ago. It's wonderful to have him back, even if it's a virtual visit. So welcome back.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and then we have another person who's saying the trajectory of insects, vines, or cicadas is fascinating. That is, what experience do you think was the seed that started both of your journeys?
Do you want us to go first, Ken, or shall I?
Oh my gosh, my journey is still ongoing, but if I had to think all the way back, wow, it's interesting that the theme of this show is like beauty and deception, attraction and deception, because orchids are notorious for that. Many of the flowers are beautiful, but they offer no reward to the pollinators. So they're deceptful. They're tricking insects to visit them, but not giving them any reward in the end. And so the reason I find that interesting is because as a kid, like so many kind of people interested in nature, I loved carnivorous plants. I just thought Venus flytraps were the coolest thing on earth. And so I had a little collection of Venus flytraps and pitcher plants. And then I was introduced to the lady slipper orchid. I'm probably like only 8 years old at this point. And I thought that the flower was carnivorous. I thought it was eating the bees and the insects that visited the flower. They're not. They're just deceptive and tricking them into coming in and doing the pollination. But that was where I got hooked. Just kind of that interaction of insects and the orchid and their close relationship. And yeah, I started growing orchids as a kid, and then college and graduate school. And then really the vanilla interest I stumbled on through my genetic analysis. So I was one of the first to start sequencing DNA from orchids. And the fact that vanilla turned out to be so different from all the other orchids really piqued my interest. And then that's the direction my research took.
It's fascinating. It's interesting that you bring up the lady slipper, because our very first talk between Darren Dooling and Paul Stankard, both of their origin stories were the lady slipper as well. And so we had another artist who made a lady slipper specific. And it was interesting that they all sort of mentioned this like golden age between 8 and 10 of like happening upon it when they used to be more frequent. They weren't quite so rare. And then realizing how incredible they are. So that's definitely been like a reoccurring kind of like origin story.
Yeah, I think so.
How about you, Jenny? What was how did you stumble upon your first cicada?
My experience comes later, actually, after I finished my BFA. I was traveling in Southeast Asia, and my background is in textiles, and I was researching minority dress in the area known as the Golden Triangle. And I came upon a garment from one of the tribes that is a shawl. And on the fringe of the shawl were strung green metallic beetle wings. Elytra is what they're called. And I had never seen anything like this. I don't know why. Was I sick on a day when we went to the Natural History Museum? I don't know. But I had never thought of insects as beautiful beyond butterflies. And I always say I have magpie tendencies. I like shiny things. And I was just enchanted with these. And I just, through more research, I learned of other groups that were using insects as embellishment, whether it was on a headdress or in a basket. And but pattern is my first love, because that's, repeating pattern. And I had that aha moment one day when I thought, I'm going to take my two interests, insects and pattern, and I'm going to put them together. And then as soon as I did that, I realized, oh, I've got something powerful here, because this pattern typically, certainly on a wall, suggests a domestic space. But what's that one thing you don't want in your house? Most of us anyway, don't want insects. So that's how it started for me. And my evolution, kind of as Ken was talking about, you start with one thing, is that I really came to insects because of their beauty. But I would say for the last 10 years, I am much more interested in insects as a vehicle to talk about the environment and climate change, and talk about how, without insects, we're not going to be around. And people don't like to hear it. And there is an insect apocalypse that's happening right now that has such serious consequences that, we've kind of woken up perhaps to honeybees, but there are a lot of insects that are doing things that are so beneficial to us that we don't realize.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where orchids are really critical as well, and can be a poster child for climate change and conservation. The theme of the Barrie Art Museum's orchid show is about the interaction of the insects more, perhaps, but orchids, in my mind, are kind of the canary in the coal mine, because not only do they have this intimate relationship to animal pollinators, hummingbirds or insects, but many of you may know that they require fungi in the soil for their seeds to germinate, and they maintain, many of them, a lifetime partnership with fungi in the soil. And then furthermore, most orchids are actually epiphytes. In the tropics, they grow on top of other plants, mostly in tree canopies. They're not parasites, they're just perched on the tree branches. So they require a host plant, an animal pollinator, and a fungal partner. And if any of those connections is broken, the whole system collapses. So they're truly the web of life, epitomized in the plant kingdom.
I think what's kind of funny is, when you think about an orchid, it sort of it's a staple, it's this design staple, but it also somehow, often, at least in our culture and Western culture, sort of in some way denotes this lavish, I don't know, like you can tell somebody's well-to-do or like well-cultured when there's an orchid in the home, right? And yet we're pushing up against that and like cockroaches, like I think about Jennifer Angus's work and when you pair these like beautiful flowers up with there's an ick factor that starts to come in with all of this, and I think that when you like you said, when you bring it into the domestic space, it feels very strange. And this is just like a side story. I'm on a tangent right now, but we had a number of students that we wanted to engage with the installation of the artworks, and we really wanted to make sure that the student body had an opportunity to work with these incredible contemporary artists that we were bringing in. And a number of them, when I said, well, great, welcome, what do you want to do? They all said, I'm not working on the insect one. That was like their number one thing. I refused to touch any insects. And I find it's really interesting when people step into the space and I show them Jennifer's work, they all just like lean in and they're really, really excited. In fact, I think if I can get my act together here, I actually think I had the video pulled up. Yeah, they lean in and they get really, really excited. And then there's this moment when they start to realize what it is that they're actually looking at. And then they all take like 3 steps backwards. And here's just like a video that shows some of the praying mantis. The Madagascar one that you were mentioning was in there a second ago. But since I have the video, I thought I would show it really quick and maybe it would spawn some more conversation.
I have a question for the two of you since you're in the arts. People ask me this all the time. Why are humans so infatuated with orchid flowers? People who've never really paid attention before go to an orchid show and they're absolutely mesmerized by the flowers. And there's this phenomenon we call orchid fever that people get, and they have to collect them. And my own theory, if you want to just present it, is that unlike a rose that has radial symmetry or like a starfish, and you look at it, you don't see a human face in a rose or a daisy. But orchids have bilateral symmetry, perfect left and right images, and they've reduced their reproductive organs to just a single structure in the center that's a fusion of the male anther and the female pistil, and it sticks out. And that looks like a nose to me. And then one of the petals is different than all the others, the bottom one, we call it the lip or the labellum. But so it's like a mouth. So when you look at an orchid flower, I think you're looking at a human face and that we can relate to it. But that's not a very scientific observation. I'm just wondering, you as artists, what do you think?
As well, your example, of going to an orchid fair, I'm not sure, but when I think of orchids, for me, mostly I think of an exotic, faraway place that is very different than my own. So to me, there's kind of a romance to that that is appealing to I'm looking out the window right now and the peonies are blossoming. I can have that in my backyard, or a rose, whereas the orchid, all of those connections that you discussed. I mean, I'm just probably, unless you lived in Florida, maybe you're not going to have that in your backyard. Right. So I think that there's the rarity too that makes it appealing.
Yeah,
that's my thought.
Maybe the psychological aspect of culture.
Yeah,
I've been watching the documentary on Netflix about Halston, the fashion designer, and he had a passion for orchids and had a $40,000 a month bill to keep orchids in his studio. So you're right, it is. They are associated with,
And this made me think. So when I came to install the work, I did get to visit the Orchid Conservancy, and now in part because of COVID, there's just the director there, and I was absolutely jealous of him to go into this otherworldly place where there's, I forget, 3 or 4, different environments depending on the orchids. It was, to me, walking into Narnia.
Yeah.
I was just so envious. And I think that that's something in COVID that we've all been wishing we could.
But isn't that what makes vanilla so special in orchids? So you're talking about something that's so exotic and rare and expensive, but to a lot of people, vanilla is like the most common ice cream flavor. And in fact, a friend of mine mentioned he was in a very fine restaurant in New York City, and they said, "Would you like dessert?" And he said, "Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe just some ice cream. What flavors do you have?" And they said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, we don't have any flavors. All we have is vanilla."
Well, for what it's worth, that's my son's favorite flavor. And he says, when you were talking about briars and the different types, I always wondered, the difference between the French vanilla, the old-fashioned vanilla. What, is there an industry standard for these descriptions or not?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting how when you go down the rabbit hole. Ooh, we have one more question. Here we go. Okay, so maybe I'll make this perhaps be our last one, since we are coming up on our timing. Although if anybody wants to pop one in the last minute, we might be able to get it in. This is from Brian Thompson. Jenny, thanks. Oh, thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation. I especially love your nod to the boundless inquisitiveness of the Victorians, who reveled in the pursuit of knowledge, truth, and authenticity. Values shared by artists and scientists and museums. Your incorporation of natural specimens in your art carries a foundation of, in fact, truth and authenticity, then carried to a fanciful, exotic, and tantalizing new dimension. Mm-hmm. We live in a very non-Victorian moment when fact and truth, what our eyes can see, is not universally valued, as museums pull us back to an appreciation for authenticity and what is real before our own eyes. Can you tell us about the conversations you have with audiences and how today's visitors are reacting to your work when you have a chance to engage with them? What do you see in the reaction to the natural material that gives grounding to your work? And is there a lesson here for museums and how they communicate with their visitors? Thank you.
Wow, those are some really great comments. I think, so as I mentioned, I'm here at the Payne Art Center and Garden, and I feel extremely fortunate that despite it being COVID, I've had 4 exhibitions up this year. This one at the Berry, as well as the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh, and what's the other one? Oh, the Museum of Wisconsin Art. And despite the fact that, sometimes they close down during this time, or people have had to make reservations, I think that people are so desperate to have experiences outside their home. And I think escape, certainly this project that I did at the Payne, which you all can go to my Instagram, I'm Insect Girl with a U. It's called The Other Side. And I was thinking about, when we're on the other side of COVID, or sadly, so many of us are saying, goodbye to friends and family and saying, see you on the other side. And I wanted the space to really be a kind of escape, otherworldly, if you will. Struck me as important, a kind of refuge at this time. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I live in Madison, so I haven't been here to actually firsthand hear people's comments, but I know that they had a record number of school group tours, mostly virtual, that there's a lot of ways to tie in when talking about insects, whether it's science, the environment, or as noted, I have this sort of fantastical element, so creative writing. So I think generally speaking, though, I can say that a lot of people do not like insects, as Charlotte kind of described. But my first goal is for people to walk into the space and say, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. Because I think we live in a world in which everything is at such a fast pace that we are very rarely amazed anymore. And then the next thing I'd like them to take away is thinking about insects differently. So even though you were afraid of the insects, wow, you saw some amazing, some beautiful insects. And isn't that incredible? And perhaps that, you know, ant or whatever that gets into your house, maybe it doesn't deserve the stomp of the foot or worse, you know, blast of raid. Could it be ushered out? I mean, who was here first after all? And could we not coexist? And I know there's like cockroaches, we cannot coexist, at least I personally can, but I just wonder, it depresses me to see Roundup being sold now. It's that time of year, or people on my local next door app, you know, saying, oh, there's a big anthill. Well, deal with it. It's fine. Why don't you watch it? It would be amazing. So those are some of the things that I think about in terms of reactions, but maybe Charlotte can answer that because you've perhaps been hearing the reactions.
Oh, we've gotten incredible reactions. I mean, the wow factor you're going for, every time people turn the corner, they go, they just stop. And they're like, was not expecting this, which is great. And we also put together a scavenger hunt where they have to count how many cicadas there are on the wall, and then they actually do it. So, so there's been a lot of really fun visitor engagement, but on a personal level, I wanted to respond to the insect thing. So I have 2 young children, and anybody with kids knows that like you're trying to explain things that have been so ingrained in you culturally that you never really stop to ask why. And my son's obsessed with bugs, and he'll find, you know, a slug and be like, Mom, come look at my beautiful slug. And I'm like, that's great, Soren, that's awesome. He's really, really obsessed with them. And when he finds a black ant, we've been talking about how he has to keep it. But then if he finds a cockroach, I freak out. And he's like, but Mom, and he'll grab it and he'll bring it to me. He's like, look at the beautiful cockroach. And I have this moment of pause where I'm teaching this child. He knows no difference between the black ant and the cockroach. You know, who am I to suddenly decide that the cockroach is unapproachable, you know? And so it's very interesting, you know, trying to explain why. And so I started to try to go down this rabbit hole where I'm like, we don't like mosquitoes because they hurt us and they can spread disease, and we love bees because they give us honey. But then you start to really talk through all these relationships and you realize it's very egocentric. It's about what it does for us. And it's not really about what it does for everybody else. And so I've been thinking a lot about that lately, and partially because of your piece. So thank you. Maybe on that note, I guess we should probably start to wrap it up. It has just been such a wonderful and organic conversation with you two of you tonight. We're really honored to have had the opportunity to have you both here. Ken, thank you for joining us. I hope you get to come back to ODU at some point soon.
It has a special place in my heart. I'd like to return.
Yeah, we would love it too. Part of the ending here is I just have to tell you guys what's coming up next. So if you enjoyed this evening's conversation, the next conversation is between Deborah Moore and Jennifer Brown. Deborah Moore is a contemporary glass artist, and Jennifer Brown works at the Harvard Museum for Horticulture. Sorry, I want to make sure I get this right because it's actually very specific. The Ware collection of Balashka glass models and plants at Harvard University. And that'll be a really fascinating discussion. We're thrilled to have them. We are open and free to the public. So if you live nearby and you haven't checked us out, we encourage you to, or check us out on our free virtual tour. Of course, I have to say, please consider becoming a museum member if you're loving all of our free programming. We couldn't do it without you. And finally, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. This has been a really delightful conversation. Thank you, Ken and Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you in Madison, Jenny.
Yeah, let's have dinner.
Bye. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.